Okay, Praying of Lot 49, 4. Though she saw Mike Fallopian again, and did trace the text of the courier's tragedy a certain distance, these follow-ups were no more disquieting than other revelations, which now seemed to come crowding in exponentially, as if the more she collected, the more would come to her, until everything she saw, smelled, dreamed, remembered, would somehow come to be woven into the Trastero. For one thing, she read over the will more closely. If it was really Pierce's attempt to leave an organized something behind, after his own annihilation, then it was part of her duty, wasn't it, to bestow life on what had persisted, to try to be what Driblet was, the dark machine in the center of the planetarium, to bring the estate into pulsing, stelliferous meaning, all in a soaring dome around her. If only so much didn't stand in her way, her deep ignorance of the law, of investment, of real estate, ultimately of the dead man himself. The bond, the probate court, had her post was perhaps her evaluation in dollars of how much did stand in her way. Under the symbol she'd copied off on the latrine wall of the scope into her memo book, she wrote, "Shall I project a world? If not project, then at least flash some arrow on the dome to skitter among constellations and trace out your dragon, whale, Southern Cross, anything might help." It was some such feeling that got her up early one morning to go to a Yoyodyne stockholders meeting. There was nothing she could do at it, yet she felt it might redeem her a little from inertia. They gave her a round white visitor's badge at one of the gates, and she parked in an enormous lot next to a Quonset building painted pink and about 100 yards long. This was the Yoyodyne cafeteria and scene of her meeting. For 2 hours, Oedipus sat on a long bench between old men who might have been twins and whose hands alternately, as if their owners were asleep, and the mold-freckled hands out roaming dream landscapes, kept falling onto her thighs. Around them all, Negroes carried gunboats of mashed potatoes, spinach, shrimp, zucchini, pot roast to the long glittering steam tables, preparing to feed a noontide invasion of Yoyodyne workers. The routine business took an hour. For another hour, the shareholders and proxies and company officers held a Yoyodyne songfest to the tune of Cornell's alma mater. They sang hymn. High above the LA freeways and the traffic's whine stand the well-known Galactronics branch of Yoyodyne. To the end we swear undying loyalty to you. Pink pavilions bravely shining, palm trees tall and true. Being led in this by the president of the company, Mr. Clayton Bloody Chicklets himself, and to the tune of Aura Lee. Glee. Bendix guides the warheads in, Avco builds them nice. Douglas, North American, Grumman get their slice. Martin launches off a pad, Lockheed from a sub. We can't get the R&D on a Piper Cub. Convair boosts the satellite into orbits round. Boeing builds the Minuteman. We stay on the ground. Yoyodyne, Yoyodyne, contracts flee thee at. DOD has shafted thee, out of spite, I'll bet. And dozens of other old favorites whose lyrics she couldn't remember. The singers were then formed into platoon-sized groups for a quick tour of the plant. Somehow Oedipa got lost. One minute she was gazing at a mock-up of a space capsule, safely surrounded by old, somnolent men. The next alone in a great fluorescent murmur of office activity. As far as she could see in any direction, it was white or pastel. Men's shirts, papers, drawing boards. All she could think of was to put on her shades for all this light and wait for somebody to rescue her, but nobody noticed. She began to wander aisles among light blue desks, turning a corner now and then. Heads came up at the sound of her heels. Engineers stared until she'd passed, but nobody spoke to her. 5 or 10 minutes went by this way, panic growing inside her head. There seemed no way out of the area. Then, by accident, Dr. Hilarious, if asked, would accuse her of using subliminal cues in the environment to guide her to a particular person, or howsoever. She came to one Stanley Kotex, who wore wire-rimmed bifocals, sandals, argyle socks, and at first glance seemed too young to be working here. As it turned out, he wasn't working, only doodling with a fat felt pencil this sign. "Hello there," Oedipus said, arrested by this coincidence. On a whim she added, "Kirby sent me." This having been the name on the latrine wall, it was supposed to sound conspiratorial, but came out silly. "Hi," said Stanley Kotex, deftly sliding the big envelope he'd been doodling on into an open drawer he then closed, catching sight of her badge. "You're lost, huh?" She knew blunt questions like, "What does that symbol mean?" would get her nowhere. She said, "I'm a tourist, actually." "A stockholder." "Stockholder?" Gave her the once-over. Hooked with his foot a swivel chair from the next desk and rolled it over for her. "Sit down. Can you really influence policy or make suggestions? They won't just file in the garbage?" "Yes," lied Oedipa. "To see where it would take them." "See," Kotex said. "If you can get them to drop their claws on patents, that, lady, is my axe to grind." "Patents," Oedipa said. Kotex explained how every engineer, in signing the Yoyodyne contract, also signed away the patent rights to any inventions he might come up with. "This stifles your really creative engineer," Kotex said, adding bitterly, "wherever he may be." "I didn't think people invented anymore," said Oedipa, sensing this would goad him. "I mean, who's there been, really, since Thomas Edison? Isn't it all teamwork now?" Bloody Chicklets, in his welcoming speech this morning, had stressed teamwork. "Teamwork," Kotex snarled, "is one word for it, yeah. What it really is a way to avoid responsibility. It's a symptom of the gutlessness of the whole society." "Goodness," said Oedipa. "Are you allowed to talk like that?" Kotex looked to both sides, then rolled his chair closer. "You know the Nefastus machine?" Oedipa only widened her eyes. "Well, this was invented by John Nefastus, who's up at Berkeley now. John's somebody who still invents things. Here, I have a copy of the patent." From a drawer he produced a Xerox wad of papers, showing a box with a sketch of a bearded Victorian on its outside, and coming out of the top 2 pistons attached to a crankshaft and flywheel. "Who's that with the beard?" said Oedipa. "James Clerk Maxwell," explained Kotex, "a famous Scotch scientist who once postulated a tiny intelligence known as Maxwell's demon. The demon could sit in a box among air molecules that were moving at all different random speeds and sort out the fast molecules from the slow ones. Fast molecules have more energy than slow ones. Concentrate enough on them in one place, and you have a region of high temperature. You can then use the difference in temperature between this hot region of the box and any cooler region to drive a heat engine. Since the demon only sat and sorted, you wouldn't have put any real work into the system, so you would be violating the second law of thermodynamics, getting something from nothing, causing perpetual motion." "Sorting isn't work," Oedipus said. "Tell them down at the post office. You'll find yourself in a mailbag headed for Fairbanks, Alaska, without even a fragile sticker going for you." "It's mental work," Kotex says, "but not work in the thermodynamic sense. We He went on to tell how the Nephastus machine contained an honest-to-God Maxwell's demon. All you had to do was stare at the photo of Clerk Maxwell and concentrate which cylinder, right or left, you wanted the demon to raise the temperature in. The air would expand and push a piston. The familiar Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge photo, showing Maxwell in right profile, seemed to work best. Oedipa, behind her shades, looked around carefully, trying not to move her head. Nobody paid any attention to them. The air conditioning hummed on, IBM typewriters chiggered away, swivel chairs squeaked, fat reference manuals were slammed shut, rattling blueprints folded and refolded, while high overhead, long silent fluorescent bulbs glared merrily. All with Yoyodyne was normal, except right here, where Oedipa Maas, with 1,000 other people to choose from, had to walk uncoerced into the presence of madness. Not everybody can work it, of course, Kotex, having warmed to his subject, was telling her. Only people with the gift. Sensitives, John calls them. Oedipa rested her shades on her nose and batted her eyelashes, figuring to coquette her way off this conversational hook. Would I make a good sensitive, to think? You really want to try? You could write to him. He only knows a few sensitives. He'd let you try. Oedipa took out her little memo book and opened to the symbol she'd copy and the words, "Shall I project the world? Box 573, said Kotex. In Berkeley. No, his voice gone funny, so that she looked up, too sharply, by which time, carried by a certain momentum of thought, he'd also said, in San Francisco there's none, and by then knew he'd made a mistake. He's living somewhere along Telegraph, he muttered. I gave you the wrong address. She took a chance. Then the waste address isn't good anymore? But she'd pronounced it like a word, waste. His face congealed, a mask of distrust. It's W-A-S-T-E, lady, he told her, an acronym, not waste. And we had best not go into it any further. I saw it in a lady's John, she confessed, but Stanley Kotex was no longer about to be sweet-talked. Forget it, he advised, opened a book, and proceeded to ignore her. She, in her turn, clearly was not about to forget it. The envelope she'd seen Kotex doodling, what she'd begun to think of as the waste symbol, W-A-S-T-E symbol, on had come, she bet, from John Nephastus or somebody like him. Her suspicions got embellished by, of all people, Mike Fallopian of the Peter Penguin Society. Sure, this Kotex is part of some underground, he told her a few days later. An underground of the unbalanced, possibly. But then how can you blame them for being maybe a little bitter? Look, what's happening to them? In school they got brainwashed, like all of us, into believing the myth of the American inventor. Morrison his telegraph, Bell and his telephone, Edison and his light bulb, Tom Swift and his this or that. Only one man per invention. Then, when they grew up, they found out they had to sign over all their rights to a monster like Yoyodyne, got stuck on some project or task force or team, and started being ground into anonymity. Nobody wanted them to invent, only perform their little role in a design ritual, already set down for them in some procedure's handbook. What's it like, Oedipa being all alone in a nightmare like that? Of course they stick together. They keep in touch. They can always tell when they come on another of their kind. Maybe it only happens once every 5 years, but still, immediately, they know. Metzger, who'd come along to the scope that evening, wanted to argue. So, you're so right-wing, you're left-wing, he protested. How can you be against a corporation that wants a worker to waive his patent rights? That sounds like the surplus value theory to me, fella, and you sound like a Marxist. As they got drunker, this typical Southern California dialogue degenerated further. Oedipa sat alone and gloomy. She decided to come tonight to the scope not only because of the encounter with Stanley Kotex, but also because of other revelations. Because it seemed that a pattern was beginning to emerge. having to do with the mail and how it was delivered. There had been the bronze historical marker on the other side of the lake at Fangosa Lagoons. On this site it read, in 1853, a dozen Wells Fargo men battled gallantly with a band of masked marauders in mysterious black uniforms. We owed this description to a post-rider, the only witness to the massacre, who died shortly after. The only other clue was a cross, traced by one of the victims in the dust. To this day, the identities of the slayers remain shrouded in mystery. A cross? Or the initial T? The same stuttered by Niccolo in the courier's tragedy. Oedipa pondered this. She called Randolph Driblet from a pay booth to see it he known about this Wells Fargo incident. If that was why he'd chosen to dress his bravos all in black. The phone buzzed on and on into hollowness. She hung up and headed for Zapp's used books. Zapp himself came forward out of a wan cone of 15-watt illumination to help her find the paperback Driblet had mentioned, Jacobean Revenge Plays. It's been very much in demand, Zapp told her. The skull on the cover watched them through the dim light. Did he only mean Driblet? She opened her mouth to ask, but didn't. It was to be the first of many demurs. Back at Echo Courts, Messenger in L.A., for the day on other business, she turned immediately to the single mention of the word Trastero. Opposite the line she read in pencil, Variant, 1687 edition. Put there, maybe by some student. In a way, it cheered her. Another reading of that line might help light further the dark face of the word. According to a short preface, the text had been taken from a folio edition, undated. Oddly, the preface was unsigned. She checked the copyright page and found that the original hardcover had been a textbook, plays of Ford, Webster, Tournier, and Warfinger, published by the Lectern Press, Berkeley, California, back in 1957. She poured herself half a tumbler of Jack Daniels, the Paranoids having left them a fresh bottle the evening before, and called the LA Library. They checked, but didn't have the hardcover. They could look it up on interlibrary loan for her. Wait, she said, having just got an idea. The publisher's up in Berkeley. Maybe I'll try them directly, thinking also she could visit John Nephastus. She had caught sight of the historical marker only because she'd gone back directly to Lake Inverarity one day. Owing to this, what you might have to call growing obsession with bringing something of herself, even that, if that something was just her presence, to the scatter of business interests that had survived Inverarity. She would give them order. She would create constellations. Next day she drove out to Vesper Haven House, a home for senior citizens that Inverarity had put up around the time Yoyodyne came to San Narciso. In its front recreation room, she found sunlight coming in, it seemed, through every window, an old man nodding in front of a dim Leon Schlesinger cartoon show on the tube, and a black fly browsing along the peak dandruffy arroyo of the neat part in the old man's hair. A fat nurse ran in with a can of bug spray and yelled at the fly to take off so she could kill it. The cagey fly stared what it was. "You're bothering Mr. Thoth," she yelled at the little fellow. Mr. Thoth jerked awake, jarring loose the fly, which made a desperate scramble for the door. The nurse pursued, spraying poison. "Hello," said Oedipa. "I was dreaming," said Mr. Thoth. Mr. Thoth told her about my grandfather, a very old man, at least as old as I am now. 91, I thought when I was a boy, that he had been 91 all his life. Now I feel, laughing, as if I have been 91 all my life. Oh, the stories that old man would tell. He rode for the Pony Express. Back in the gold rush days, his horse was named Adolf. I remember that. Oedipa, sensitized, thinking of the bronze marker, smiled at him as granddaughterly as she knew how, and asked, did he ever have to fight off desperadoes? That cruel old man, said Mr. Thoth, was an Indian killer. God, the saliva would come out in a string from his lip whenever he told about killing the Indians. He must have loved that part of it. What were you dreaming about? Oh, that, perhaps embarrassed. It was all mixed in with a Porky Pig cartoon. He waved at the tube. It comes into your dreams, you know. Filthy machine. Did you ever see the one about Porky Pig and the Anarchist? She had, as a matter of fact, but she said no. The Anarchist is dressed all in black. In the dark, you can only see his ears. It dates from the 1930s. Porky Pig is a little boy. The children told me that he has a nephew now, Cicero. Do you remember during the war when Porky worked in a defense plant, he and Bugs Bunny? That was a good one, too. Dressed all in black, Oedipa prompted him. It was mixed in so with the Indians, she tried to remember. The dream. The Indians who wore black feathers. The Indians who weren't Indians, my grandfather told me. The feathers were white. Those false Indians were supposed to burn bones and stir the bone black with their feathers to get them black. Made them invisible in the night because they came at night. That was how the old man, bless him, knew they weren't Indians. No Indian ever attacked at night. If he got killed, his soul would wander in the dark forever. Heathen. If they weren't Indians at a past, what were they? A Spanish name, Mr. Thoth said, frowning. A Mexican name. Oh, I can't remember. Did they write it on the ring? He reached down to a knitting bag by his chair and came up with blue yarn, needles, patterns, finally a dull gold signet ring. My grandfather cut this from the finger of one of them he killed. Can you imagine a 91-year-old man so brutal? Oedipus stared. The device on the ring was once again the WASTE symbol. She looked around, spooked at the sunlight pouring in all the windows, as if she had been trapped at the center of some intricate crystal, and said, my God. And I feel him, certain days of a certain temperature, said Mr. Thoth, in barometric pressure. Did you know that? I feel him close to me. Your grandfather? No, my God. So she went to find Fallopian, who ought to know a lot about the Pony Express and Wells Fargo if he was writing a book about them. He did, but not about their dark adversaries. I've had hints, he told her. Sure, I wrote to Sacramento about that historical marker. They've been kicking it around their bureaucratic morass for months. Someday, they'll come back with a source book for me to read. It will say, old-timers remember the yarn about whatever happened. Old-timers. Real good documentation, this California crap. Odds are the author will be dead. There's no way to trace it, unless you want to follow up an accidental correlation, like you got from the old man. You think it's really a correlation? She thought of how tenuous it was, like a long white hair over a century long. Two very old men, all these fatigued brain cells between herself and the truth. Marauders, nameless, dressed in black, probably hired by the federal government. Those suppressions were brutal. Couldn't it have been a rival carrier? Fallopian shrugged. Oedipus showed her the waist symbol, and he shrugged again. It was in the ladies' room. Right here in the scope, Mike. Women, he only said. Who can tell what goes on with them? If she thought to check a couple of lines back in the Warfinger play, Oedipa might have made the next connection by herself. As it was, she got an assist from one Genghis Cohen, who was the most eminent philatelist in the LA area. Metzger, acting on instructions in the will, had retained this amiable, slightly adenoidal expert. for a percent of his valuation to inventory and appraise in variety stamp collection. One rainy morning, with mist rising off the pool, Metz drew away again. The paranoids off somewhere to a recording session. Oedipa got rung up by this Genghis Cohen, who even over the phone she could tell was disturbed. "There are some irregularities, Miss Moss," he said. "Could you come over?" She was somehow sure, driving in on the slick freeway, that the irregularities would tie in with the word Trastero. Metzger had taken the stamp albums to Cohen from safe deposit storage a week ago in Oedipa's rented Impala. And then she hadn't even been interested enough to look inside them. But now it came to her, as if the rain whispered it, that what Fallopian had not known about private carriers, Cohen might. When he opened the door of his apartment office, she saw him framed in a long succession or train of doorways, room after room receding in the general direction of Santa Monica, all soaked in rainlight. Genghis Cohen had a touch of summer flu. His fly was half open, and he was wearing a Barry Goldwater sweatshirt also. Oedipa felt at once motherly. In a room perhaps a third of the way along the suite, he sat her in a rocking chair and brought homemade dandelion wine in small, neat glasses. "I picked the dandelions in a cemetery 2 years ago. Now the cemetery is gone. They took it out for the East San Narciso Freeway." She could, at this stage of things, recognize signals like that. As the epileptic is said to, an odor, color, pure, piercing grace note announcing his seizure. Afterward, it is only this signal, really dross, this secular announcement, and never what is revealed during the attack that he remembers. Oedipa wondered whether, at the end of this, if it were supposed to end, she too might not be left with only compiled memories of clues, announcements, intimations, but never the central truth itself, which must somehow each time be too bright for her memory to hold, which must always blaze out, destroying its own message irreversibly, leaving an overexposed blank when the ordinary world came back. In the space of a sip of dandelion wine, it came to her that she would never know how many times such a seizure may already have visited, or how to grasp it should it visit again. Perhaps even in this last second. But there was no way to tell. She glanced down the corridor of Cohen's rooms in the rain and saw for the very first time how far it might be possible to get lost in this. "I have taken the liberty," Genghis Cohen was saying, "of getting in touch with an expert committee. I haven't yet forwarded them the stamps in question, pending your own authorization and of course Mr. Metzger's. However, all fees, I am sure, can be charged to the estate." "I'm not sure I understand," Oedipa said. "Allow me." He rolled over to her a small table, and from a plastic folder, lifted with tweezers delicately, a U.S. commemorative stamp, the Pony Express issue of 1940, 3-cent Hannah Brown, cancelled. "Look," he said, switching on a small intense lamp, handing her an oblong magnifying glass. "It's the wrong side," she said, and he swabbed the stamp gently with benzene and placed it on a black tray. The watermark. Oedipa peered. There it was again, her waist symbol, showing up black, a little right of center. "What is this?" she asked, wondering how much time had gone by. "I'm not sure," Cohen said. "That's why I've referred it. And the others to the committee? Some friends have been around to see them too, but they're all being cautious. But see what you think of this." From the same plastic folder he now tweezed what looked like an old German stamp, with the figures 1/4 in the center, and the word Freemark on the top, and along the right-hand margin the legend Thurn und Taxis. They were, she remembered from the Wharfinger place, some kind of private couriers, right? From about 1300 until Bismarck bought them out in 1867, Miss Moss. They were the European mail service. This is one of their very few adhesive stamps. But look at them in the corners. Decorating each corner of the stamp, Oedipus saw a horn with a single loop in it, almost like the waist symbol. A post horn, Cohen said. The Thurn and Thaxis symbol. It was in their coat of arms. In Tacit lies the gold once knotted horn, Oedipa remembered. Sure. Then the watermark you found, she said, is nearly the same thing, except for the little dewjigger sort of coming out of the bell. It sounds ridiculous, Cohen said, but my guess is it's a mute. She nodded. The black costumes, the silence, the secrecy. Whoever they were, their aim was to mute the Thurn and Taxis post horn. Normally this issue and the others are unwatermarked, Cohen said, and in view of other details, the hatching number of perforations, way the paper has aged, it's obviously a counterfeit, not just an error. Then it isn't worth anything? Cohen smiled, blew his nose. You'd be amazed how much you can sell an honest forgery for. Some collectors specialize in them. The question is, who did these? They're atrocious. He flipped the stamp over, and with the tip of the tweezers showed her. The picture had a Pony Express rider galloping out of a western fort. From shrubbery over on the right-hand side, and possibly in the direction the rider would be heading, protruded a single, painstakingly engraved black feather. Why put in a deliberate mistake? He asked, ignoring, if he saw it, the look on her face. I've come up so far with 8 in all. Each one has an error like this, laboriously worked into the design, like a taunt. There's even a transposition, US postage, of all things. How recent, blurted Oedipa, louder than she needed to be. Is anything wrong, Miss Moss? She told him about the letter from Mucho, with a cancellation, telling her report all obscene mail to her potsmaster. Odd, Cohen agreed. The transposition, consulting a notebook, is only on the Lincoln 4-cent regular issue, 1954. The other forgeries run back to 1893. That's 70 years, she said. He'd have to be pretty old. If it's the same one, said Cohen. And what if it were as old as Thurn and Taxis? Omidio Tacitus, banished from Milan, organized his first couriers in the Bergamo region around 1290. They sat in silence, listening to rain gnaw languidly at the windows and skylights, confronted all at once by the marvelous possibility. Has it ever happened before? She had to ask. An 800-year-old tradition of postal fraud? Not to my knowledge. Oedipa told him then all about Mr. Thoth's signet ring, and the symbol she'd caught Stanley Kotek's doodling, and the muted horn drawn in the ladies' room at the Scope. Whatever it is, he hardly needed to say. They're apparently still quite active. Do we tell the government? Or what? I'm sure they know more than we do. He sounded nervous, or suddenly in retreat. No, I wouldn't. It isn't our business, is it? She asked him then about the initials WASTE, but it was somehow too late. She'd lost him. He said no, but so abruptly, out of phrase now, with her own thoughts, he could even have been lying. He poured her more dandelion wine. It's clearer now, he said, rather formal. A few months ago, it got quite cloudy. You see, in spring when the dandelions begin to bloom again, the wine goes through a fermentation, as if they remembered. No, thought Oedipa, sad, as if their home cemetery in some way still did exist. in a land where you could somehow walk and not need the East San Narciso freeway, and bones still could rest in peace, nourishing ghosts of dandelions. No one to plow them up, as if the dead really do persist, even in a bottle of wine. All right. End of chapter 4.